Chief. I'm an associate professor and extension specialist in environmental science. I'm also the PI of the NSF Indigenous Youth Training Program. So I want to welcome each and every one of you to this seminar series, which is co-sponsored by the University of Arizona Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership, the Indigenous Youth Program, and the School of Natural Resources and the Environment. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the University of Arizona, which sits on the homeland of the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaqui peoples, whose care and keeping of these lands allow us to be here today. I'm really excited today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Dan Wildcat. I've known Dr. Wildcat for over 15 years now, and he's such a big role model for me. And over the years of my own professional peer and career training, he has been a mentor to me, and I'm sure he's been mentor to many, many Indigenous STEM young people. Dr. Dan Wildcat is Yuchi member of the Muscogee Nation of Oklahoma. He's a professor at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas, where he's been teaching over 30 years. Dr. Wildcat is an accomplished scholar who writes on Indigenous knowledge, technology, environment, and education. He's also the co-director of the Haskell Environmental Research Studies Center, which he founded with colleagues from the Center for Hazardous Substance Research at Kansas State University. Dr. Wildcat is the co-author with Vine Deloria Jr. of Power and Places, Indian Education in America. And he's also the co-editor with Steve Pavilik of Destroying Dogmas, Vine Deloria Jr. and his influence on American society. Known for his commitment to environmental defense and cultural diversity, Dr. Wildcat has been honored with the Heart Peace Award for the Kansas City-based organization, The Future Is Now. And for me, my biggest influence from Dr. Wildcat is his work on Indigenous knowledge and climate change. He's also written a book that I have in my possession called Indigeneity. And having been influenced by his outstanding work, I acknowledge his inspiration to me for the Indigenous Youth Program, because I often hear him coining the word indigeneity. And so when I came up with the acronym of Indigenous Youth, I thought of that similar aspect of fusing indigeneity into food, energy, water, STEM training. So without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Wildcat virtually to the University of Arizona, and I hope that one day we can actually bring you physically on campus. It would just be such an honor to have you with us. Thank you again, and we look forward to your talk. Dr. Wildcat.
Yeah, San Lei, Gayasada. Thank you so much, Carla, for that very wonderful introduction. Fasan, Selagi, Zoyaha, Yuchiha, Muscogee. Yes, my name is Dan Wildcat. I said, good afternoon. How are you all doing? I am a Yuchi member of the Muscogee Nation, more commonly known as the Creek Nation of Oklahoma. And I want to acknowledge the fact that I'm speaking to you from my home office, just less than a half a mile as the crow flies from the south bank of the Kansas River, which takes its name from the original earth keepers of this place where I sit along the Kansas River, the Kaw people or the Kanza people. Who ironically, due to federal government policies, now reside no longer in the state that their name became the state's name nomenclature for this area, now resides in Oklahoma. So what can you say? But I'm mindful of the fact that I'm sitting between the Kansas River and my own campus, Haskell Indian Nations University, which is really a part of it is on the Wakarusa River wetlands. So I want to honor the Kaw people. I want to honor the Osage and a lot of the people who moved through this area too. We're really on the eastern edge of that great, tall grass prairie of the Great Plains. And so there were a lot of tribes that moved through this area, but the homeland, this was the homeland of the Kaw Nation and the Kaw people. And so I want to acknowledge that, and I'm really thankful for the soil and the water from these rivers and the air I breathe and everything in this beautiful place, this beautiful part of Mother Earth. So, this is a topic that I speak on often, and I like to speak about opportunities, STEM opportunities for Indigenous peoples, because any of you who are familiar with my work know that I take a very strong position that right now science needs Indigenous thinkers. It's kind of interesting, we talk in our own traditions, about oral tradition, storytelling, and I'm not saying this is exactly equivalent, but it strikes me as funny today that two of the quotes that you most often hear from people who are thought leaders today and people who are making, often public presentations, they use quotes that are apocryphal. In other words, they're attributed to people that we have no evidence that they ever said these things, but they're powerful insights, right? So the first one I'd like to share with you is the quote that's attributed to Mark Twain, although no one can find any evidence that Mark Twain ever said this. And it goes something like this. When asked some evidence, some advice, if he had any advice for a young man, the quote goes something like this. Well, just remember, it's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you think you know that just ain't so that causes all the problems. I think right now we need a serious examination of some of the underlying assumptions that have driven the kinds of modern institutions we see in industrial, and now some people might argue post-industrial societies. I think that, asking serious questions about what we think we know right now is very important, because as this alleged Twain wisdom points out, often it's what we think we know that ain't so that really causes, the problems. So think of what I'm saying today, what I'm going to share with you in that context. And then I'll use the second apocryphal quote. This one is attributed to no less than Albert Einstein. And again, no evidence that Albert Einstein ever said this, but it sounds like something Albert Einstein might have said, that creative genius. And it goes like this: when allegedly asked if he had any advice on a very complicated physics problem by a colleague at Princeton, New Jersey, after he had escaped the Nazis in Germany and made his home at Princeton University during the Second World War. Asked what advice he had. Several days later, the colleague came back in and said, well, do you have any advice on this problem? How we might solve this problem? And the quote goes like this: remember, you can't always solve problems with the same kind of thinking that created them. Well, that's sounds like something, Einstein might have said, but its wisdom rings pretty authentic. And I would say right now, if you take both of those pieces of wisdom that are out there in the ether, it should make Indigenous people feel pretty good about the opportunities we have to help people rethink some of the underlying assumptions they hold about the world and how it works and our human place on this beautiful blue-green planet, this Mother Earth. And the good news is that if you're looking for ways of thinking that haven't really had an opportunity to be fully explored in depth, you need look no further than the worldviews and the wisdom of the first peoples of this land. We had a colonial interruption. It's still ongoing to a large extent of our own intellectual and cultural traditions. And we're fortunate that we have peoples in our communities who've maintained our languages, who have maintained our customs, our ceremonies, our songs, our prayers, and still retain tremendous insight and knowledge about what it means in their particular communities, their homelands, to be a Dene person, to be Pueblo, to be Passamaquoddy, to be Penobscot, to be Anishinaabe, Comanche, Kiowa, Seminole, Creek, Lummi, Duwamish, Suquamish. And I think that's pretty incredible because that we have this knowledge that still resides to a great extent. Because remember, only a little more than a century ago, we were predicted to be the vanishing Americans. We were not expected to be here. And so we are still here. And although some peoples have lost a tremendous lot, it's still amazing how much knowledge and wisdom and culture has maintained and is still here. So that's kind of the backdrop to the remarks I'm going to make today, and try to advance this argument to all of you. If you're Indigenous students, I hope this will resonate with you. If you're a professor and work with Indigenous students or a department chair, or probably don't have any deans listening to this, or academic VPs, this is really the talk they probably should hear. I would make the argument today that, again, we need more than ever American Indian, Alaska Native, Indigenous peoples from all around the world to be recruited and sought to participate in science programs. Now, that comes with responsibilities to those who are doing the inviting, and I'll just speak about that for a second. There was a time, I think, and I believe we've moved beyond that at this point, but I think there was a time, even when I was still an undergraduate student, where you could find some science programs and scientists who might tell a young undergraduate Native student that, well, when they're doing science, they can just leave their culture and their traditions at the door because we're doing science now. And I would argue that nothing could be further from the truth. Science itself is a particular lens that one puts on to look at the world. And it has assumptions and that it's objective because a lot of people agree with them and say, okay, those are reasonable assumptions to make if we're going to do this kind of. But I think one of the things we've got to disabuse ourselves of is that the activity of science is value free. It is not value free. I think Indigenous people have to bring to science are some other assumptions. Everyone works with assumptions. Some other ways of knowing and insights that could be useful, and to understand some of the complex today. I know a number of people, whether they're scientists or ecologists, economists, social scientists, you keep hearing people use this term wicked. They describe wicked problems. Climate change is certainly one of those problems that is wicked. What do we mean by wicked? Well, we know there's no experiment we can design to test climate change. It's wicked. There are so many factors. It's a part of this, what has happened now and culminated in the age of the Anthropocene, this age of humans, is that our behavior and our conduct is fundamentally changing some of the major Earth systems on the planet. And so that one of the things that we need to be thinking about is, it seems in a very appropriate time to try to draw in people who, one, never thought in silos or worked in silos, and certainly never thought in boxes. We talk a lot about silos today in the academy. We talk about the fact that, as my good friend Roger Pawardi, who works at the research lab for NOAA in Boulder, always likes to say to scientists when he gets the opportunity to speak to them in a university setting, that, hey, let's be honest, we're sitting in the middle of one of the largest problems we have. What is that? He says, think of it this way. The world has problems, and we have in universities departments. We'll play that game. Which department are we going to send that problem to? Oh, over to economics. No, let's send it over to sociology. Oh, let's send it over to the ecology folks or the biology folks. Well, it turns out the most serious problems we face today have ecological, biological, economic, sociological, psychological dimensions to them. I would say right now, those of you Native students who are listening to this presentation, hold on to your tribal worldviews and traditions that never tried to pull those things apart and put them in boxes, but instead thought about our lives really as functions of these very complex relationships we are engaged in, biologically, sociologically, economically. I think, this is something that offers a comparative advantage for Indigenous students who are welcomed into programs where people are indeed trying not to solve problems with the same kind of thinking that created them, who are in the midst now of questioning some of our underlying assumptions that have driven the kind of development and institutions that we're all a part of in our everyday lives. And so, right, it's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It might be what we know that just ain't so, that causes all the problems. So I think this is something that we should be really encouraging K through 12 education to encourage this kind of critical inquiry, this method of inquiry. It's all right to ask questions. It's all right to question things, but it's also important to understand that as you question things, as you examine things, one has to always be open to taking in as much information, as much new information as you can bring to bear on any problem that you're addressing. So I'm really an advocate for programs, whether any program that is looking to tackle difficult problems, to be thinking about how they might encourage young Native students into those areas and fields of study. I'm also thinking that, one of the things that we have an obligation to do, those of us who've been in the academy for a while now and universities, is to really start creating, some spaces where we can have that truly interdisciplinary kind of work going on. If you look at many institutions that are offering interdisciplinary degrees, I know my degree, most people don't know this, but my PhD is interdisciplinary degree. From the University of Missouri at Kansas City. And at the time when I was coaxed back into graduate school, I didn't think I ever needed a PhD. And I had some good friends and people who mentored me who said, "No, Wildcat, you need to get that. That's your union card if you want to, get involved in these higher level discussions and things." And I said, well, okay, if I'm going to be, in higher education, I guess so. You don't need that if you're going to be in your community and working with your people, and some of the wisest people I've met don't have PhD or any of those, initials after their name. But what they do have is they have, an accreditation that's conferred by their people, by their community, for the wisdom that they hold. So it's not, it depends on how you want to contribute. There's work for everyone right now. But I will say this, I think right now, so when I got my interdisciplinary degree, they didn't tell me until I was well into it that what interdisciplinarity meant at the University of Missouri at Kansas City at the time was that we're going to let you take courses in economics, political science, sociology, public policy, and administration. Oh, and I kept thinking, okay, well, where's my seminar where I'm going to have the economists together with the policymaker and the sociologist? And they said, oh, well, we don't do that. You just take those courses in those different departments. When it got time to take comprehensive exams, I was a little bit miffed because I had to take, not just exams in public policy and administration, which was my core discipline. I had to take economics and sociology and political thought. Oh, this is great. So the interdisciplinary comes in me putting it together. The institution didn't make any effort to say, this is what interdisciplinary studies is. And so I think we still put that burden on a lot of students. I don't know where we're having the social worker do a climate change seminar with an economist and a climate scientist. I hope U of A is doing those. I would be surprised if it's happening. But that's what we need right now. We need to totally, cross these artificial boundaries. They're artificial in a Yuchi, a Zoyaha way of thinking. So what are the opportunities today in STEM? I'm one of these people who happens to believe that right now, because of the crises that we're facing, there are opportunities everywhere you look. It doesn't matter if you want to work on water. It doesn't matter if you want to, it depends on where you live, of course. We all know climate change manifests itself differently in different places. It's not a one size fits all phenomenon. It's an equal opportunity crisis. It affects the Arctic in very unique ways. It affects the Great Plains in ways. It's affecting the desert Southwest in unique ways. And that's, I think, something that's important to understand too. I think in our indigenous traditions, we have this opportunity to really if we choose to do that, to really situate the work we want to do within our homelands, within our communities, and help solve the very serious problems that climate change will produce and that will present to us in those places we call home. I'm a big believer in the fact that, again, one of the advantages of indigenous thinking and why I think we need more indigenous scientists is because we never really experienced this nature culture dichotomy that's so prevalent in the Western tradition, because in our traditions, who we were culturally, in our language, in our customs, in our habits, in the food we ate, and in the way we lived, the dwellings that we made, these were functions of where we lived. Our identities, our tribal identities, were the process of this long symbiotic interaction between a people and place. Carletta for mentioning the book that Vine Deloria and I worked on in early 2000, came out in 2001, Power and Place, Indian Education in America. Deloria said, this is a fundamental axiom. Deloria's formulation was the fundamental axiom of indigenous metaphysics is power plus place equals personality. And really what he meant was that, the world is, I'm not talking about the kinds of power we see them talking about on Fox News or CNN or MSNBC. I'm talking about that other kind of power, that physical power, that spiritual power, that presence we are in daily. All of us are in right now. And it always expresses itself uniquely, though, in a particular place. And so it's that triangulation of these relationships and exchanges of energy and power that give us our unique personalities, both individually, but my work has really been sort of in drawing that out to say, I think that axiom applies also to indigenous peoples. You understand the uniqueness of a Dene worldview as compared to a Passamaquoddy worldview of those indigenous folks in Maine, by understanding that you first have to situate that understanding in the relationships, the power that place possesses and is always expressed through relationships, through processes. This is the kind of thinking that I think is advantageous to helping us solve some of the wicked problems we're facing today on the planet, whether those be, climate change or issues of systems of economic injustice or injustice in the criminal justice system. And now, we talk about justice, we talk about food justice, we talk about housing justice. And why do we talk about these things? Because we see that we're often embedded in systems that are fundamentally systemically unjust. And so I think that, again, that's another example here of how indigenous people bring some really valuable insights into the real practical exercise of science. I don't think anyone needs to adopt a romantic view of nature. I tend to tell my very rigorous now and again, by the way, I'm finding out there are fewer and fewer of these very rigorous physical scientists today. A lot of them do seem to open to realizing there's a lot of these relationships and processes that are real, but we can't quite put into an experimental situation, or we can't dissect them on a table, but they're nevertheless very real. And we see them and the processes and the way they cycle through different systems. But I think that the thing I always tell people is if you want a fairy tale view of the world, you should probably start with this idea that somehow the world's all about humankind and we're in charge and our job is to control nature. I think luckily we're living in an age where a lot of thought leaders across the academy, all disciplines, are recognizing that that's the kind of thinking that put us in the age of the Anthropocene. And the kind of thinking that's going to get us out of there is going to be a very different kind of systemic thinking, systems-based, process-based thinking. And I'm looking at people, I can only see a few people on the screen, but I'm looking at some of you who I'm just delighted to see you in the audience because I know the kind of work you do and you're working on those. That's the challenge now. We have got to really be very proactive, adamant, if you will, about arguing that we have got to really rethink old paradigms about, quote, natural resource management. What was it? I think Sylvia Earle in her book, The World is Blue, talked about the fact that even when we look at the oceans today, which now are attracting a lot of attention due to climate change, it's still weird that, fisheries, by and large, commercial fisheries still operates by something called maximum sustainable yield, which ultimately is based on a lot of assumptions that are unsustainable, that you can't keep fishing that way. And now there's something called economic sustainable yield. Well, it tweaks it slightly, but I'm going to argue that probably the real value of the ocean is going to have to be expressed in something other than economic resource terms to fully capture the value, just like those of you that are working in ecology and environmental science are arguing, the value of a forest is much more than the board feet of lumber you can produce out of it. And we need to try to get people to reframe, rethink how they're approaching these things. I want to argue Indigenous people that are still connected to their traditional worldviews need to hold on to that because there's right now an opportunity to really look at the world through a lens that sees relationships, that is trying to break out of these silos of disciplinary rigor and this thinking in boxes that people used to talk about. There are people on the planet who don't think that way. So I continue to make the case that right now, no matter where you look, there's a good opportunities. There are opportunities, I think, if the institutions are prepared and welcoming for Indigenous people to really play a role in helping to address the creation of new paradigms. New for some, maybe they're very, very old in our own traditions, our ways of thinking. But we've also got to be open to the fact that we're going to learn stuff too. I mean, another thing that I think is desperately absent at the academy today is humility. I think we've got to really start admitting, as much as that pains people sometimes, we're not trained to do that. You're not trained in higher education to ever say you don't know. We have a kind of mentality that you've got to answer that question. That's the question. You've got to answer it. You got to have an answer. Well, what if you just said, you know what? I don't know the answer. Well, that's a good start. All good research scientists understand that. But we have a perception at the general public that, scientists are supposed to have the answer. This is part of the problem we have with climate change education. To people who still think of science as they were taught it back in junior high, when they were taught, remember, the experimental method. We got a bunch of scientists that don't use the experimental method per se. They use models, they use modeling, they use all kinds of ways of approaching knowledge, and particularly of those very wicked problems where we can't design an experiment to control how we're going to solve the climate change issue. It is truly a global and a wicked problem. But that's really kind of opens the door to saying what we need more than ever is as many minds and people who don't think alike, but maybe have very different perspectives on things coming together to tackle problems. And that means we've got to work on how we can explain sometimes very complicated things that we use in academic shorthand to describe. It's fine if you're a PhD in biochemistry and you can use all this shorthand to talk about something that's going on with other PhD biochemists. But if your grandma wants to know what it is you're studying, often, you can imagine the scientists will say, well, Grandma, I can't really explain it. I mean, and besides, you wouldn't be interested anyway. Well, that's part of the problem. If it's an important area of research, then it should be of importance to your grandma, to your auntie, and to your uncle. I'm continue to make the case that right now we have Deb Holland, the first woman American Indian Secretary of Interior. And I'm thinking that if Deb Holland brings her traditions to work with her, we might see some very different policies emerge out of the Department of Interior. Now, I have no illusions. One person in that political machine of the federal government, even a secretary, has power that's constrained often, politically, situationally within that larger federal government system. But just to have a person who will speak openly and honestly about maybe different ways of approaching development, how we think of the land, the air, and the water, the plants and the animals, I think could be tremendously advantageous right now, given the wicked problems we are facing. So I'm thankful that Carla, has the grant money to sponsor, programs like this. I'm honored that I was invited to speak. I'm really humbled by that. We need right now to bring as many minds as we can together to have very open and honest discussions about where we're at on the planet, different places on the planet. So again, but we're tied together by the fact, my Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota relatives, they have that beautiful phrase in their language you hear quite often in prayers, Matakiwe Oyase. What does that mean? Well, they're honoring to all of our relations, to all of my relations. And that includes the plants and the animals. That includes all of life. And after all, I mean, this is kind of interesting, and isn't this kind of interesting that modern science, particularly evolutionary theory tells us we're all related. Modern ecology tells us we're all connected. And those two principles seem to be widely accepted in many indigenous worldviews. What they add to it is that place that it decenters humans out of that. It's not all about us. The world doesn't revolve around us. We're one small, but albeit very powerful part of this sort of complex set of relationships. Now we've found out just how powerful we are. We're calling the age we live in the age of man, the Anthropocene or Anthropocene. And so far, the things that mark that aren't necessarily good. It's a decline in biological diversity on the planet, a decline in water quality and air quality, and I think it's really important now. We create spaces like this, and universities are going to adopt land acknowledgements. Let's not let those become a check the box activity. If you're going to acknowledge the first people, the first earth takers, and that land itself, and the soil, and the water, and yes, the air we breathe. I mean, that we are that, right? We are all of that in this body. But for that, we would not exist, land, air, water. I think we've got to really make it clear that that acknowledgement comes with responsibilities. So let me close my remarks, because I'd love to have questions, and I hope you're going to really test my mettle with the questions. Here's my 2-minute elevator speech now. People ask me, okay, what are you thinking? What are you working on? My elevator speech for now, it has three points. Number one, we need desperately to change our worldview to one that more mirrors indigenous traditions, intellectual traditions. I'm speaking in generalities. You can find exceptions of probably some indigenous people somewhere that might not accept this, but generalities are just that. They widely apply. I think this widely applies. I probably wouldn't say this if I hadn't been at Haskell Indian Nations University for the last 35 years. Number one, we need to leave behind the worldview that we're surrounded by natural resources and begin to acknowledge that we live in a world full of relatives. If we do that, it leads us to move to the second paradigm shifting premise. What we've learned in the last year is we have some people that we live with that think the only political axiom that's meaningful is that regarding their inalienable rights. I know of no people on the planet who take individual liberties and rights as importantly as indigenous people, but I also know that from my interaction with a number of people, that many see those rights as hollow unless they are counterbalanced with inalienable responsibilities that we have. And this is where the two combine. When we live among resources, we spend all of our time arguing about who has the right to use them. If you live among relatives, you've got another paradigm now. We've got to ask ourselves, what's our responsibilities to our relatives and how can we live well? I think right now, the paradigm of living among relatives and asking ourselves very what our human responsibilities are is a much more productive discussion if we're going to address climate change and a host of other problems than having arguments about who owns what and who has the right to use it. Let's move from worldview dominated by resources to one of relatives. Let's move from thinking about inalienable rights as being basically hollow unless counterbalanced with inalienable responsibilities. And if we do that, we open up that kinship view of the life we are all a part of. And in that kinship view, we start to think of all these complex relationships we have. And I think there's where we have a new kind of thinking that can be very productive. That systems thinking, that relational thinking, a thinking that focuses more on processes than examining what kind of product we want to produce. But if we do that, I would like to suggest we could have a new measure of success. Sustainability seems to be, that was the term du jour a while back. Now people are moving away from sustainability and wanting to talk about, resilience. Resilience is good, but what does resilience mean? I'd like to bounce this off of you. Suppose if we took these first two premises I'm advocating of moving from resources to relatives, from exclusively preoccupied rights to balancing those with inalienable responsibilities we have, maybe the measure should be, at the end of the day, can we demonstrate that what we have done and how we have lived has produced systems of life enhancement on the planet? Not human comfort, not simply human comfort, human convenience, and human wealth, but that we've demonstrated we can be good relatives to all of the beautiful life on this thin biosphere, this cloak of our Mother Earth. I'm going to stop right there, and I'd love to get comments and questions. Thank you very much, everyone. Gadasawa.
Yeah, Dr. Wildcat, thank you so much for your talk. And for the audience here, if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask directly. Thank you.
Now, come on, I know we've got some questions out there.
I'm wondering if you could talk about the type of interdisciplinary program at your institution then that hopefully you've moved to that you didn't find when you were in a PhD program. And
but I wish we had those. The closest thing we have at my institution at Haskell Indian Nations University, the closest thing we have is still trapped in what some people call a discipline, but we don't act like it's a discipline. And that's our Indigenous and American Indian Studies program, where basically we try to bring everything into it: environmental science, law, policy, social work. And so if you happen to get a degree, the only degree, we only offer bachelor's degrees. We have 4 programs at Haskell: an environmental science, an elementary education, a tribal business and management, and an Indigenous and American Indian Studies. And I'm glad to say that our Indigenous and American Indian Studies program at Haskell is very interdisciplinary. And, but, I keep holding out. We tried about 6 years ago to put together a truly interdisciplinary program where students could kind of create their own degree, drawing from business, environmental science, and Indigenous studies. And guess what we found out? Those silos are real. They're hard to break people up. Man, I mean, people just, well, no, they've got to have this course, they're not going to, have business credentials if they don't have this. one environmental science. Well, no, you got to have, well, before you know it, we've got 160-hour baccalaureate degree. Well, who wants to do that, And so this is a challenge, isn't it? And I think the way we break that is we start figuring out ways to rethink our courses. We just do that stuff in the courses we teach. We fold in, the physical science, the social science, the philosophy. The closest experiment we did at Haskell, and there's an article somewhere about this in the Tribal College Journal, probably about 10 years ago. One of my colleagues wrote it up, but I kept talking to our physics instructor. I said, Tom, we've got it. We're never going to be able to do this interdisciplinary program we want. Let's just do it. And he said, okay, how are we going to do it? And we got together. So we took physics, we took philosophy courses, we took a writing course in the English department, and Leslie Evans, who taught pottery. And we said, what we're going to do is we're going to build in every 2 weeks lectures where all of those students have to listen to what the potter has to say about philosophy, about physics, the physics of firing pottery. And we just sort of created this thing. We scheduled it very intentionally, so we knew we could get together. And everyone loved it, But again, that was a one-off, and I know how hard it is. I mean, we're a small college at Haskell, but here's why we need to get deans and academic VPs involved in this discussion. They're going to say, oh yeah, that's great. We'd love to let you do that interdisciplinary course. Where are you going to get the release time, from your courses in my program to do that? And so, yeah, if you can pay it and you want to do that extra work, go ahead. Those are the kinds of systemic problems we've got to challenge.
Thank you, Dr. Wildcat. We do have a question from Gwineria Isaac. Okay. If you want to just go ahead and ask your question. I saw your hand raised for a while now.
Sure. I love the talk. It was brilliant, very inspiring. So I'm coming from the National Museum of Natural History in DC, part of the Smithsonian. And we have mentoring programs where students come to work one-on-one with scientists. Mm-hmm. And I have definitely seen how there can be real heartbreak and issues where students are not understood, right? So they come into a pre-existing system. So it's not like the university where
right.
faculty mixing things up and kind of making these creative ideas. So you're really asking for students to be in this difficult situation.
Yes.
How would you advise me as I work really hard to break the mold of our institution, but how would you advise me to help these students and find ways to both create space for them, but then also to help educate the people that are mentoring them? What are some of the issues? And I would love to have the recording of this lecture available to people in my museum, because I think it will completely transform some of their misconceptions about this area and what's possible for them to do.
Yeah.
So that's one step. But if you have any other advice, it'd be fantastic.
Well, this is the hard work. And thank you, Gwineria, for being in the Natural History Museum and the Smithsonian and doing this hard work. But I'm going to tell you, I think the thing to do is you find those scientists who are out there, and they're out there, who understand what I'm talking about and who are allies and who are really trying to do this work, and bring them in to do those colloquia for your in-house scientists, and say, hey, I'm working, with Indigenous people. There's some people out there who are really doing some good work. We need to bring them in. And I think that's one of the things you can do. But it's hard work because a lot of people are perfectly comfortable, in that space they've created. And they think it's the student's responsibility to adapt and fit in that particular space, without any regard that they're losing out, because by having those students, those young people, other scholars with different ways of thinking there, it might open up some windows for them, some opportunities to see something through a little different lens, But it's hard work. Thank you for doing it. And yeah, we'll stay in touch, but it's hard work. It is. I think it's getting better though. I am an optimist. I believe it's getting better.
Yeah. Thank you, Guadera, for your question. We do have another question, and this will be the last question before we end the seminar, from Nancy Peterson. And she asks, what interdisciplinary conversation would you suggest a university start with if the topic is resilience? What disciplines would you invite?
Yeah, okay. If the topic is resilience, I would ask the university to begin, first of all, with an examination of what their mission is. Literally, what is the education mission and vision of the University of Arizona? And I would argue right now that every institution, particularly universities of higher education, should have very explicit statements about responsibility they have in the work they do to promoting systems of life enhancement. And they can talk about human communities, they can talk about the land. If they're doing land acknowledgements, they better darn well do that. But I think it's at that level. Now, I know probably none of you can recite what the vision statement or the mission statement of University of Arizona is, but those are important because regents, politicians who provide funding to you, although I know it's increasingly very little that comes from state governments to support state institutions. I think it's really important to say, we've got to send a signal that we all recognize the challenges we're facing. And again, I would argue that leads you then to an attempt to say, we could incorporate a lot of the problem solving that we think needs to be done within the activities of our own institution. That really opens up the door to a much deeper discussion about education reform in higher education. I'll just say this: get students out of doors. If they're social workers or psychologists, get them out of doors. We need people out of doors. And that will make a difference in how they think about the world and see the world. And they might even discover they're a part of a much larger community than they ever imagined.
Thank you, Dr. Wildcat. Thank you so much for an inspiring talk today and for being with us here virtually. I want to thank you for your time, and we're so honored to have you here. To the audience, thank you so much for your questions, and I want to thank those sponsors, the Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership and the School of Natural Resources and the Environment and the NSF IndigiFuse training program. I want to invite you to our next speaker, which will be on April 21st at 3 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Our speaker will be Michael Katawa Johnson, who is Hopi of the Native American Agricultural Fund.
Yay.
Yes, you know, Michael,
Yes.
it's going to be a great talk. So join us